She bought an abandoned mill for $40, and what she found hidden inside its walls had been waiting for her for 75 years. If you enjoy stories about second chances and secrets that time couldn't erase, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because this is one you'll want to hear from the very beginning. Evelyn Calloway gripped the steering wheel with both hands and watched the highway stretch ahead like a gray ribbon unraveling into the mountains. The Blue Ridge rose on either side of her, soft and ancient, their peaks blurred by October fog. She had been driving for 9 hours. Her back ached. Her coffee had gone cold somewhere around Virginia. And the passenger seat beside her, the seat where Frank used to sit with his arm resting against the window, humming songs he never remembered the words to, that seat was empty. It had been empty for 6 months now. She was 75 years old. She had buried the only man she ever loved on a Tuesday morning in April, standing in a cemetery in Connecticut, while the dogwood trees bloomed as if nothing had happened. 48 years of marriage reduced to a headstone and a stack of sympathy cards she couldn't bring herself to open. For weeks after the funeral, she sat in the living room of their house and listened to the silence. She waited for the grief to ease. It never did. Instead, it settled into the furniture, the curtains, the smell of his jacket still hanging by the door. Every room held a version of Frank that no longer existed. Every corner whispered a memory she couldn't outrun. So she stopped trying. She sold the house. She sold most of the furniture. She packed 3 boxes of things she couldn't let go: a quilt. Her mother made a 10 of old photographs, Frank's reading glasses, and she loaded them into the back of her station wagon. Her daughter called from Boston and told her she was making a mistake. Her neighbors said she was acting impulsively. Her doctor suggested she might be depressed. Maybe she was, but Evelyn didn't want a diagnosis. She wanted a road that led somewhere she had never been. She drove south. No plan, no reservation. Just the highway and the hum of the engine and the strange stubborn belief that if she kept moving, she might eventually find a place where the weight on her chest didn't feel so heavy. Bellhaven appeared late in the afternoon. The sign at the edge of town was faded white letters on green metal, half covered by ivy. Population 4,200. The kind of number that told you everyone here knew everyone else's business. She pulled off the highway because the gas gauge was low and the light was turning golden over the mountains. And something about the way the town sat in the valley, quiet, patient, unhurried, made her slow down. She found a gas station, then a small motel called the Ridge Rest, run by a woman named Darla who talked too much and charged too little. The room was clean. The bed was firm. The window looked out over a row of maple trees losing their leaves in slow, lazy spirals. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. She had no idea why she stopped here. She had no reason to stay. But when she woke the next morning, she didn't leave. The first week passed slowly. She walked the streets. She ate breakfast at a diner called Pauline's, where the coffee was strong and the waitress called everyone home. She discovered a fabric shop 2 blocks from the motel and spent an hour running her fingers over bolts of cotton and linen, the way she used to before arthritis made her hands stiff. Sewing had been her life. 40 years of alterations, repairs, custom dresses for weddings and funerals. She missed the sound of her machine. She missed the feeling of thread pulling through cloth, turning something torn into something whole. One morning, while browsing listings in a small real estate office on Main Street, she found it. The photograph was pinned to a corkboard behind the desk, half hidden by newer listings. It showed a large building. Brick walls, tall windows, a pitched roof sitting alone at the edge of a dirt road. The structure was massive. It looked like it had been something important once. Now it looked like something the world had forgotten. The price was written in blue ink on a yellow tag. $40. Evelyn read it twice. She looked at the agent, a young man with a loose tie and a patient smile. "Is that a misprint?" He laughed the way someone laughs when they have heard the same question 100 times. He explained that the building was an old textile mill built in the early 1900s. It had changed hands many times. There were unresolved title issues, delinquent taxes, structural concerns. Nobody wanted the headache. The county had been trying to unload it for years. $40 was less a price and more a dare. Evelyn asked to see it. That afternoon, she drove 3 miles east of town down a narrow road lined with oak trees. When she rounded the last curve, she saw it. The mill stood at the end of a gravel path surrounded by overgrown grass and wildflowers that had claimed every inch of ground around it. The brick was dark with age. Several windows were cracked. The main door hung slightly open, as if the building itself had given up trying to keep anyone out. She stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and damp wood and something faintly metallic, the ghost of old machinery. The space was enormous. High ceilings with exposed beams, concrete floors stained by decades of use. Along the walls, rusted brackets showed where looms once stood in neat rows, turning thread into cloth. Most people would have seen ruin. Evelyn saw something else. She saw the light coming through the tall windows. She saw the bones of the building, solid, patient, waiting. She saw a place where something could be built again. She signed the papers that Friday. The clerk at the county office handed her a small ring with 2 keys, one for the main door, one for a side entrance. The metal was cold and rough in her palm. She closed her fingers around them and felt a strange certainty she couldn't explain, as if those keys had been waiting for her specifically, as if they had always belonged in her hand. The work began immediately. Every morning she drove out to the mill before sunrise. She swept floors. She hauled broken crates and rotted wood to a growing pile behind the building. She scrubbed walls with a wire brush until her shoulders burned. She was 75 years old, and her body reminded her of that fact constantly in her knees, when she knelt, in her wrists, when she lifted in the small of her back at the end of every day. But the pain felt different from the grief. The pain meant she was doing something. The grief just meant she was still alive. It was during the second week that she met Walter Braxton. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in a faded blue pickup truck, carrying a toolbox and a clipboard. He worked for the county, retired technically, but still called in when someone needed an electrical inspection or a plumbing assessment. He was 72, tall, thin. His hair was silver. His eyes were calm, and he moved with the slow deliberateness of a man who had learned that rushing rarely improved anything. "You're the one who bought the Whitfield mill." Evelyn paused, the broom still in her hand. She hadn't heard anyone call it that before. The listing had simply read, "Old Mill, East Road." Whitfield. Walter set his toolbox down. "That's what the old-timers call it. Used to belong to a family by that name. Long time ago." He looked around the space, studying the walls the way a doctor studies a patient. "Mind if I check the wiring? Some of these old places still have knob and tube. Wouldn't want you plugging anything in and burning the whole thing down." She let him work. He moved through the building, methodically testing outlets, examining junction boxes, making notes on his clipboard. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his voice was steady and unhurried. He told her which areas were safe and which needed rewiring. He pointed out a section of the roof that would need attention before winter. He showed her where the old water lines ran beneath the floor. Before he left, he paused at the door. "My wife passed 3 years ago, cancer. I spent the first year sitting in my workshop staring at a piece of walnut I was supposed to be carving. Never touched it." He looked at the mill, then back at Evelyn. "Second year I picked up the chisel. That helped more than anything anyone told me." He nodded, once placed his cap back on his head, and walked to his truck. He came back the next day. He didn't announce himself, just appeared with a box of wire nuts and a roll of electrical tape and started working on the panel in the back room. Evelyn didn't ask why. She just brought him coffee in a paper cup and set it on the windowsill where he could reach it. That became their routine. Every morning she arrived first. Every morning his truck appeared within the hour. They worked in different parts of the building, sometimes not speaking for long stretches. And when they did talk, the conversations were small. What the weather would do, where to find replacement hinges, whether the oak beams above the main floor were original. But small conversations have a way of growing when two people share a quiet space. By the third week, she knew that he had been a carpenter for 40 years. that his wife's name was Marianne, that he had a son in Raleigh who called every Sunday but never visited. She told him about Frank, about the house in Connecticut, about the feeling of waking up every morning in a place where everything reminded her of someone who was gone. Neither of them used the word lonely. They didn't need to. It was on a Thursday afternoon, 4 weeks after she bought the mill, that everything changed. They were clearing a back section of the building that had been blocked by old shelving units and stacks of wooden pallets. Walter had suggested removing the shelves to open up the space. As they pulled the last unit away from the wall, Evelyn noticed something behind it, a door. It was smaller than the others in the building. The frame was made of darker wood, older, and the surface was covered in a thick layer of grime that had solidified over decades. There was a keyhole near the handle, small, round, rusted shut. Evelyn ran her fingers across the door. The wood was cold. She tried the handle. It didn't move. Walter knelt beside her and examined the lock. This hasn't been opened in a very long time. He pulled a small can of penetrating oil from his toolbox and worked it into the mechanism. They waited. He tried again, then again. On the fourth attempt, something inside the lock gave way with a sound like a bone cracking. The door opened slowly, scraping against the concrete floor. A wave of stale air rushed out, cool, heavy, carrying the smell of forgotten years. Neither of them spoke. The room was small, maybe 12 feet by 15. The walls were bare brick, stained by moisture. A single window near the ceiling had been boarded shut from the outside, allowing only a thin blade of light to cut through the darkness. There was a table, 2 chairs, a metal filing cabinet with one drawer hanging open, and on the table, centered precisely as if someone had placed it there with care, a wooden box. It was smaller than a shoebox. The wood was dark cherry or mahogany, Evelyn couldn't tell, and unlike everything else in the room, it was clean. Not spotless, but protected. Someone had wrapped it in cloth at some point, shielding it from the dust and damp that had consumed everything else. Evelyn's hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, arranged with a precision that suggested reverence, were photographs, letters in yellowed envelopes, folded documents tied with faded ribbon, and beneath them all a single photograph that stopped her breath. 2 newborn girls, lying side by side on a white blanket, their faces so similar they could have been reflections. Each wore a tiny bracelet, one pink, one lavender. Their eyes were closed. Their fists were curled. They looked peaceful, unaware that the world they had just entered would separate them before they could ever know each other. Evelyn brought the photograph closer to the dim light. Her eyes moved across every detail. Then she saw it. On the left shoulder of one of the babies, small, distinct, unmistakable, a birthmark. Dark, irregular, shaped like a crescent pressed into the skin. Evelyn's free hand moved on its own, slowly, deliberately. She reached across her chest and touched her own left shoulder. The same spot, the same shape, the same mark she had carried for 75 years without ever questioning where it came from. Walter saw her face change. He stepped closer. "Evelyn, what is it?" She didn't answer. She pulled the collar of her shirt aside just enough to reveal the small dark mark near her collarbone. Then she held the photograph next to it. Walter looked at the image, then at her shoulder, then at the image again. His expression shifted from curiosity to something much deeper, something that didn't need words. The room was silent. The mill was silent. The whole world seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn placed the photograph carefully back inside the box, her hands steadier now than they had been a moment ago. She picked up one of the envelopes and opened it. Inside were documents, partial birth records, property registrations, letters addressed to names she didn't recognize. One name appeared again and again: Whitfield, the same name Walter had mentioned weeks ago when he first walked into the mill. The family that had built this place, the family that had disappeared. She spent the rest of the afternoon reading every document she could decipher. Some were too damaged. Others were written in legal language she couldn't fully understand. But the shape of something was emerging, something large and painful and hidden for a very long time. That night, back in her room at the Ridge Rest, Evelyn sat on the bed with the photograph in her lap. The motel was quiet. The mountains outside were black against a sky full of stars. She could hear the faint sound of wind moving through the maples. She picked up her phone and called the adoption agency in Hartford, the same number she had filed away decades ago and never dialed. It rang 4 times. A recorded message told her to call back during business hours. She left her name and number and said she was requesting access to her original file. 3 days later, a woman from the agency called back. There were records. They were old, partially sealed, but accessible under current law. Evelyn gave her date of birth, her adoptive parents' names, the information she had carried, like a weight she never examined. The woman was quiet for a long moment. Then she confirmed it. Evelyn had been born in western North Carolina. The county matched. The date matched. And there was a notation, faded, barely legible, that referenced a second child associated with the same intake file. A second child. Evelyn sat in the parking lot of the motel with the phone pressed to her ear, watching the afternoon light move across the mountains. 75 years. She had lived an entire life, raised a daughter, buried a husband, grown old without knowing that somewhere in this world there might be another woman who shared her face, her blood, her beginning. She hung up the phone. She opened the glove compartment and took out the key ring, the 2 old keys the county clerk had given her the day she bought the mill. She held them in her palm. Such ordinary things. Ordinary metal, ordinary teeth, ordinary weight. And yet one of them had opened a door that led her to a room, that led her to a box, that led her to a photograph that was now leading her somewhere she never expected to go. She wondered how many doors were left. She wondered if she was strong enough to open them all. And she wondered with a feeling that was equal parts terror and hope who was waiting on the other side. The adoption agency sent the documents by mail. Evelyn checked the motel's front desk every morning for 3 days, until Darla handed her a thick manila envelope with a Hartford return address and a look that said she was dying to ask what was inside. Evelyn took it to her room. She sat at the small desk by the window, spread the pages in front of her, and read them the way someone reads a letter from a ghost, slowly, carefully, afraid of what the next line might say. Most of the information was redacted. Black bars covered names and addresses. Entire paragraphs had been removed. But what remained was enough. Her birth had been registered in Ashford County, North Carolina. The intake date matched the period referenced in the documents from the wooden box. And there, buried in a footnote on the 3rd page, typed in faded courier font, was a single line that confirmed what she already suspected. See associated file, second minor, same date of origin. She placed the papers on the desk and pressed her palms flat against the surface. Her hands were shaking again, not from age, from the weight of knowing that a sentence typed on a government form 40 years before she was born had been sitting in a filing cabinet in Hartford while she lived her entire life 3 hours away, never once asking the question that would have led her here. She brought everything to the mill the next morning. Walter was already there, replacing a section of baseboard in the main hall. She spread the adoption records next to the documents from the wooden box on a plywood table they had set up as a workspace. He wiped his hands on his jeans and stood beside her, reading without touching, as if the papers were something fragile that might dissolve. We need someone who knows the history of this area, not what's in the official records, what people remember. Walter thought for a moment. Then he said a name. Maeve Aldridge. Maeve ran the Bellhaven Public Library, which was less a library and more a museum disguised as one. She had worked there for over 40 years and had a memory that the townspeople compared to a steel trap with a grudge. If something happened in this county in the last century, Maeve either witnessed it, catalogued it, or heard about it from someone who did. They found her behind the circulation desk, sorting through a box of donated paperbacks with a pair of reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose. She was small, sharp-featured, and looked at Evelyn with the evaluating gaze of a woman who had spent her life deciding whether people deserved the information they were asking for. Evelyn placed the photograph of the 2 newborns on the desk. Maeve picked it up. She held it at arm's length, then close. She turned it over, examined the blank back, turned it again. Her expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. "Where did you get this?" "Inside the mill, the old textile mill on East Road." Maeve set the photograph down carefully, as if it were made of something more delicate than paper. She removed her glasses. "Come with me." She led them to a back room filled with filing cabinets, microfiche readers, and cardboard boxes stacked against every wall. For the next 2 hours, she pulled folders, unrolled maps, and retrieved newspaper clippings preserved in plastic sleeves. She didn't explain as she worked. She simply built a landscape of documents on the table, piece by piece, and let Evelyn read. The Whitfield family had been one of the most prominent in the region. They owned land hundreds of acres stretching from the valley floor to the foothills. The textile mill was the centerpiece of their business, employing nearly a third of the town at its peak. The family built roads, funded the school, donated the land where the library now stood. In Bellhaven, the Whitfield name once carried the weight of a founding dynasty. Then in the spring of 1951, a car accident on a mountain road killed two of them, Thomas Whitfield and his wife Catherine, both in their late 20s. The newspaper clipping was brief, 4 paragraphs, a grainy photograph of the wrecked vehicle, and a headline that called it a tragedy that shook the community. What the article didn't mention was children. Maeve noticed the gap at the same moment Evelyn did. Strange, isn't it, a couple that young, that prominent, and not a single word about whether they left anyone behind. She reached into one of the boxes and produced a second clipping, smaller, from a different paper dated 3 weeks after the accident. It referenced a private arrangement regarding the estate and dependents of the deceased. No names, no details, just a single sentence acknowledging that something existed and had been handled quietly. Evelyn stared at the word. Dependents. Plural. That afternoon, she and Walter drove to the Ashford County Courthouse. The building was old brick federal style, with a rotunda that smelled of floor wax and aged paper. A clerk directed them to the records office in the basement, where a man named Gerald spent 20 minutes searching through ledgers before producing a file marked with a case number and a date. The file was thin. Much of it had been sealed by court order decades ago. But what remained confirmed the newspaper's careful omission. Thomas and Catherine Whitfield had twin daughters, born the same year, registered in the county. And after the accident, the children had been placed under the guardianship of separate families through a private legal arrangement that bypassed the normal adoption process. Separate families. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Gerald leaned back in his chair. The Whitfield estate went through probate for years after the accident. I've seen references to it in other files. Lot of lawyers involved. Lot of money moving around. He paused. Lot of people interested in where it ended up. That evening, Evelyn visited Don Harlan. Don lived in a small house on the south end of town, surrounded by a yard that hadn't been mowed in recent memory, and a porch lined with coffee cans filled with nails sorted by size. He was 89 years old. His hearing was unreliable, and his knees had quit on him years ago, but his memory stretched back to a time when the Whitfield mill still hummed with looms, and the family name still hung over Bellhaven like a canopy. He remembered the accident. He remembered the funeral, big formal, the whole town turning out in black. He remembered the weeks that followed when strangers in suits appeared at the courthouse and the mill went silent for the first time anyone could recall. And he remembered the rumor. There were babies, he said, rocking slowly in his chair. Twin girls. Everybody knew about them. Catherine used to walk them through town in a double stroller, proudest mother you ever saw. He stopped rocking. After the accident, nobody talked about those babies anymore. It was like somebody decided they didn't exist. What happened to them? Don looked at Evelyn for a long time. His eyes were pale and watery, but there was nothing vague about the way he studied her face. One of them went north. That's what people said. Sent away to a family up in New England somewhere. The other one stayed local. Got taken in by a family called Ashford. The name hit Evelyn like a current. She gripped the arm of her chair. Ashford, are they still here? The old ones passed years ago, but the girl they raised, she's still around. Lives over in Ridgemont, about 30 minutes east. He paused again, and something in his expression softened. Her name is Constance. Evelyn didn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark at the ridge rest and listened to the wind and thought about a woman named Constance who lived 30 minutes away and had no idea that the sister she was separated from at birth was lying awake in a motel room, terrified of what would happen when they finally stood face to face. Walter offered to drive. She was grateful. Her hands were too unsteady for the wheel. They took his truck east on Route 9 through rolling farmland and small crossroad communities where churches outnumbered gas stations. He didn't fill the silence with conversation. He simply drove and let her sit with the enormity of what was about to happen. The community fundraiser in Ridgemont was held in the parking lot of a Methodist church. There were tables covered with baked goods, a raffle for a handmade quilt, and a small stage where a high school bluegrass band was playing something earnest and slightly out of tune. Evelyn moved through the crowd, slowly scanning faces, feeling ridiculous and overwhelmed and desperate all at once. Then she saw her. Constance Ashford was standing near a table stacked with jars of homemade preserves, talking to a woman in a yellow cardigan. She was Evelyn's height, her build, her posture, that slight forward lean shoulders, drawn back chin lifted. Her hair was white, cut short, and her hands moved when she spoke in exactly the same way Evelyn's did. The same gestures, the same rhythm. Evelyn stopped walking. The noise of the fundraiser faded into something distant and muffled, like sound heard through water. Her vision narrowed until there was nothing in the world except the woman 20 feet away who was wearing her face. Constance turned. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither moved. The people around them continued talking, laughing, reaching for cookies and lemonade, completely unaware that two women who had entered the world together 75 years ago were seeing each other for the first time since the day they were born. Constance took a step forward, then another. Her hand rose slowly to her mouth. Her eyes filled. "Oh my God." The words came out as a whisper. Evelyn couldn't speak at all. She stood rooted to the pavement, tears running down her face while the bluegrass band played on, and the October sun poured over the parking lot. And a lifetime of not knowing crashed into a single unbearable moment of recognition. Constance reached out and touched Evelyn's face. Her fingers were trembling. "You look like me." Evelyn managed 3 words. "I know I do." They held each other in the middle of that church parking lot for a long time. People noticed. People stared. A few of the older women covered their mouths and looked at each other, with the stunned expressions of people witnessing something they always suspected but never expected to see confirmed. Walter stood at a distance, his cap in his hands, watching with the quiet expression of a man who understood that some moments don't belong to you, and the best thing you can do is stay close without getting in the way. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Evelyn had experienced. She and Constance met almost every day. They talked for hours about their childhoods, their marriages, their losses. They discovered overlapping habits that made them laugh in disbelief. Both took their coffee black with 1 sugar. Both hummed when they were concentrating. Both had spent their lives feeling an absence they could never name, a hollow space that didn't correspond to any specific loss. Just a vague sense that something fundamental was missing. They were filling that space now, rapidly, hungrily, as if trying to pour 75 years of sisterhood into weeks. But not everyone was celebrating. Judith Ashford appeared at the second meeting. She was Constance's niece by adoption, the daughter of Constance's adoptive brother, raised in the household after her own parents divorced. She was 52, well-dressed, precisely spoken, and carried herself with the controlled energy of someone accustomed to managing situations. She managed Constance's finances. She managed her medical appointments. She managed her social calendar. She had managed Constance's life for so long that the arrangement had become invisible, accepted by everyone as simply the way things were. She shook Evelyn's hand and smiled in a way that involved her mouth but not her eyes. "Connie's told me all about you. What an extraordinary story." Evelyn thanked her. Something about the handshake felt like a warning. Over the following days, Judith began asking questions. Not to Evelyn directly, never directly. She asked them to Constance in private in the kitchen over morning tea during car rides to the pharmacy. Gentle questions, concerned questions, the kind of questions that sound like protection, but function as poison. Has she explained exactly why she came to Bellhaven? Out of all the places in the country, she happened to end up here. Have you thought about why she's so interested in the Whitfield history? It's not just about finding a sister, is it? I'm not saying anything is wrong, Connie. I'm just saying be careful. People aren't always what they seem. Constance brushed the comments aside at first. But doubt once planted grows in the dark. And Judith was patient. She had learned long ago that the most effective way to control someone was not to command them, but to make them afraid. Meanwhile, Evelyn made a discovery that shifted everything. She had been organizing the documents from the wooden box, sorting them chronologically, matching names to dates, trying to construct a timeline. Walter helped when he could, but the legal language was dense and the records were incomplete. One evening, while cross-referencing property registrations from the courthouse with the papers found in the mill, she noticed something that made her sit up straight. The mill's original deed was registered to Whitfield and Sons Textile Company. The land it sat on, all 12 acres, was part of a larger parcel that once encompassed nearly 300 acres of valley and hillside. After Thomas and Catherine died, the property was broken up and sold in pieces over the following decade. The transactions were buried in county records, scattered across different filing systems, handled by different attorneys. But when Evelyn laid them all out on the plywood table in the mill and traced the path of ownership from 1951 to the present, the pattern was unmistakable. The land had been sold below market value, repeatedly, to buyers connected to the same small group of people. And the proceeds, whatever money those sales generated, never appeared in any accounting related to the Whitfield estate or the trust that was supposed to have been established for the children. The fortune hadn't vanished. It had been siphoned, quietly, methodically, by people who knew exactly what they were doing, while two infant girls were being shipped off to separate lives in separate states. Evelyn pressed her palms against the table. The wood was rough under her fingers. She looked around the mill, the building her parents had built, the building that had employed a town, the building that had been stripped of its value and left to rot, while the people who profited from the theft lived comfortably for decades. She had bought her own family's legacy for $40, and she hadn't even known it. She told Constance. She laid out the documents, explained the connections, showed her the trail of transactions. She expected shock. She expected anger. She expected her sister to sit beside her and say, "Let's find out who did this." Instead, Constance looked at the papers and then looked at Evelyn with an expression that broke something inside her. "Are you sure about all of this? These are very old documents, Evelyn. How do we even know they're real?" The question wasn't hostile. It was cautious, measured, and it carried the faint echo of someone else's voice, someone who had been whispering doubts into Constance's ear for weeks. Evelyn recognized that echo. She just didn't know its source yet. The distance grew slowly. Constance still called, but the calls were shorter. She still visited the mill, but she sat closer to the door as if keeping an exit route open. When Evelyn mentioned the Whitfield estate, Constance changed the subject. When she brought up the possibility of contacting an attorney, Constance said she needed time to think. The sister who had held her in a church parking lot and cried with the joy of a lifetime was pulling away, and Evelyn could feel it happening inch by inch, conversation by conversation, like watching a door close in slow motion without being able to reach the handle. One evening, after a particularly strained phone call, she sat alone in the mill. The main hall was dark except for a single work light hanging from a beam. The shadows stretched across the floor like long fingers. She held the key ring in her hand, the same two keys the clerk had given her months ago. She turned them over slowly, feeling the teeth press into her skin. 75 years old, a dead husband, a sold house, a sister who was slipping away, a past full of lies that nobody wanted uncovered. She had come to this town looking for a place to start over, and instead she had stumbled into a story so large and so broken that she wasn't sure she had the years left to see it through. For the first time since she arrived, she considered the possibility that she had made a mistake, that some doors were closed for a reason, that maybe the kindest thing she could do for herself, for Constance, for everyone, was to lock the mill, return the keys, and drive back north to a quiet life that asked nothing of her except to wait. She was still sitting there when she heard the truck pull up outside. The headlights swept across the windows. The engine cut, a door opened and closed. Footsteps crossed the gravel. Then the side door creaked and Walter stepped inside. He didn't ask what was wrong. He could see it. He walked across the hall, pulled a folding chair from against the wall, set it beside hers, and sat down. For a while, neither of them spoke. The mill settled around them, small sounds of old wood adjusting to the cold, the distant call of an owl somewhere in the trees outside. Then Walter said something she would remember for the rest of her life. "Truth doesn't have an expiration date, Evelyn." She looked at him. His face was calm. His hands rested on his knees. He wasn't trying to convince her of anything. He was simply stating something he believed to be true, the way he might say that oak is stronger than pine, or that a square joint holds better than a mitre. He reached over and placed his hand on top of hers. His palm was warm and rough and steady. She didn't pull away. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his, and they sat together in the dark mill, while the mountains outside held the sky and the keys in her pocket pressed gently against her thigh, waiting as they always had to be used. Evelyn didn't leave. She didn't lock the mill. She didn't drive north. She woke the next morning in her room at the Ridge Rest, with Walter's words still settling inside her, like something solid placed on a shelf. And she understood that leaving would not make the truth smaller. It would only make her smaller for having walked away from it. She returned to the mill before dawn. The air was sharp with November cold. Frost had etched white patterns across the windshield of her station wagon, and her breath came out in thin clouds as she unlocked the side door and stepped inside. The building held the night's chill in its brick walls, and the main hall felt cavernous in the dark, a cathedral of dust and silence and unfinished work. She pulled the chain on the work light. The bulb swung gently, casting slow-moving shadows across the floor. Then she walked to the back room, where the plywood table held the documents she had been organizing for weeks, sat down and began again. She started with the papers she had already read and moved outward, cross-referencing dates and names with the records Maeve had pulled from the library archives. Walter arrived an hour later with 2 coffees from Pauline's and a cardboard tube he had picked up from the courthouse. Inside was a set of original survey maps from the 1940s, showing the full extent of the Whitfield property before it was divided. They spread the maps across the table and weighed the corners with wrenches and coffee mugs. And for the rest of the morning, they traced boundaries, matched parcel numbers, and built a clearer picture of what had been taken and by whom. By mid-afternoon, they had identified a pattern that connected several of the post-accident transactions to a single legal firm, one that no longer existed, but whose partners had gone on to hold positions of influence throughout the county. The connections were circumstantial but consistent. Someone had orchestrated the dismantling of the Whitfield estate with precision, and they had done it while 2 infant girls were being erased from the public record. The following week brought an answer Evelyn hadn't expected, and it didn't come from the documents. It came from Constance. On a Tuesday afternoon, Constance called. Her voice sounded different, raw, unsteady, stripped of the careful composure she usually maintained. She asked if Evelyn could come to her house. Not the mill, not a restaurant. Her house. There was something she needed to show her. Evelyn drove to Ridgemont alone. Constance met her at the front door. Her eyes were red. She was holding a stack of envelopes bound with a rubber band. She had found them that morning. She hadn't been looking for anything, just reorganizing a guest bedroom closet that Judith used for storage when she stayed overnight. Behind a box of old tax files pushed against the back wall of the shelf was a leather portfolio. Inside were letters, correspondence between Judith and an attorney in Asheville spanning more than a decade. The earliest letter was dated 14 years ago. In it, the attorney referenced inquiries from a woman in New England who was searching for birth records connected to Ashworth County. The attorney recommended that no response be provided and that the relevant files remain sealed. Judith had replied with a single handwritten note at the bottom of the page. Agreed. No contact. Keep me informed of any further attempts. Constance placed the letters on the kitchen table one by one in chronological order. Each one told the same story from a different angle. Someone, possibly Evelyn herself, possibly another searcher, had come close to the truth multiple times over the years. And each time Judith had intervened. Quietly, efficiently, without ever telling Constance that her twin sister might be alive and looking for her. Constance's hands were shaking, not the gentle tremor of age, the violent trembling of a woman whose foundation had just cracked beneath her feet. She knew Evelyn. She knew for 14 years, maybe longer, and she never said a word. Evelyn sat across from her sister and said nothing. There was nothing to say that the letters hadn't already said. She simply reached across the table and placed her hand over Constance's, and they sat together in that kitchen while the afternoon light moved across the floor, and the truth settled over them like ash after a fire. Judith arrived at the house 2 hours later. She walked through the front door carrying a bag of groceries and stopped when she saw both women sitting at the table with the letters spread between them. Her face went pale. Then it went still. The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour. It moved through stages: denial, then deflection, then a defense so practiced it sounded rehearsed. Judith said she had acted to protect Constance. She said the Whitfield history was complicated, that dredging up the past would only cause pain, that there were legal and financial considerations that Constance didn't understand. She said she had carried the burden of knowing alone because she loved Constance too much to risk losing her. Constance listened to all of it. When Judith finished, the kitchen was quiet. A clock ticked on the wall. Outside, a dog barked somewhere down the street. Then Constance spoke, and her voice was steadier than it had been all day. You didn't keep this secret because you loved me, Judith. You kept it because you were afraid of what would happen if I found out. Those are not the same thing. Judith opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I'm 75 years old. Constance continued. I had a sister for 75 years and didn't know it. You took that from me. Not the accident, not the lawyers, you. Every single day you chose not to tell me was a day you decided your comfort mattered more than my life. She stood up. She gathered the letters into a neat stack. And then she did something that surprised even Evelyn. She placed the stack gently into Judith's hands. I'm not going to fight with you. I'm not going to scream or threaten or make this uglier than it already is, but I need you to leave. And I need you to understand that what we had, whatever it was, cannot continue the way it was. Judith left without another word. The front door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded in the silence of the kitchen like something final. In the days that followed, the sisters began the slow work of reassembling what had been broken. They didn't rush it. They had learned, both of them separately, over the course of long lives, that the things most worth building cannot be hurried. They met at the mill most mornings. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they simply occupied the same space, sorting through boxes or sweeping floors, content with the quiet company of someone who understood without needing to be told. Evelyn continued organizing the documents from the hidden compartment. With Constance beside her now, the work felt different. Less like an investigation, and more like an excavation, two women carefully brushing dirt from the bones of a life they were supposed to have shared. One morning, while clearing the last section of the back room, a corner they had never fully reached because of a collapsed shelving unit. Walter helped them move a section of the original hardwood floor that had buckled with age. Beneath it, wedged into a narrow gap between the floor joists and the foundation, was a single envelope. It was sealed, yellowed. The paper was brittle but intact, protected from moisture by the tight space and the dry mountain air. There was no address on the front, no stamp, just a name written in a careful, elegant hand. For my girls. Evelyn held the envelope for a long time before opening it. Constance stood beside her. Neither spoke. Walter stepped back and busied himself with something across the room, giving them the privacy he knew they needed. The letter inside was 2 pages. The handwriting was the same as the name on the envelope, fluid, deliberate, the penmanship of someone who had been taught to write beautifully and still believed it mattered. It was dated March 1951, 6 weeks before the accident. Their mother's name was Catherine. She wrote the way she must have spoken, warmly, directly, without pretension. She wrote about the mill, about how she and Thomas had spent their first years of marriage in this building, turning it from a failing operation into something the whole town depended on. She wrote about the sound of the looms in the morning, how the vibration traveled through the floor and into her bones, and how she sometimes stood in the doorway with a cup of coffee and watched the light come through the tall windows and thought that this was what it meant to build something real. She wrote about her daughters, about the weight of them in her arms, the way they slept facing each other, as if even in dreams they needed to know the other was near. She wrote about her hopes for them. Not grand ambitions, just the quiet prayer of every mother that her children would be safe, that they would be loved, that they would find their way. And in the final paragraph, she wrote something that made both sisters stop breathing. I don't know what the future holds. Nobody does. But if anything should ever separate our family, if distance or circumstance or the cruelty of the world should divide what we have built, I want you both to know that this place will be here. This mill, these walls, this is where your father and I began everything. This is where we brought you home for the first time. And if you are ever lost, if you ever need to find your way back to the beginning, come here. Come to this place, because everything I have loved is written into these walls, and love does not leave the places where it was first spoken. Constance sat down on the floor, slowly, as if her legs had simply stopped working. Evelyn lowered herself beside her. The letter rested between them on the dusty hardwood, and they read it again together. This time their eyes moving across the same lines, at the same pace, synchronized in a way that felt less like coincidence and more like something encoded in their blood. Evelyn reached into her pocket and took out the keyring. 2 small keys on a thin metal loop. She placed them on the floor beside the letter. She had carried them for months. She had used them to open the main door, the side entrance, the hidden room. She had held them on the night she almost gave up. She had turned them over in her palm while sitting in the dark, wondering if she was strong enough to keep going. Now she understood what they had been opening all along. Not doors, not locks, not rooms full of forgotten papers. They had been opening her life, the real one, the one that had been sealed shut 75 years ago by people who decided that 2 little girls were less important than the money their family left behind. Constance picked up the keys. She held them the way Evelyn had pressed into her palm, the teeth biting gently into skin. Then she looked at her sister and smiled. It was the first real smile Evelyn had seen from her in weeks. Not cautious, not measured. Just the uncomplicated joy of a woman sitting beside someone she was always meant to know. They stayed on the floor of that mill for a long time. The afternoon light came through the tall windows and laid gold across the old brick walls. Outside, the Blue Ridge stood in their ancient patience, wearing the last colors of autumn rust and amber, and deep burgundy, as if the mountains themselves had dressed for the occasion. Somewhere in the trees, a cardinal was singing. The air smelled of cold stone and dry leaves, and something faintly sweet like wood that has been warmed by sun. Walter appeared in the doorway. He saw them sitting together. He saw the letter. He didn't come closer. He leaned against the frame with his arms folded and watched the light move across the floor. And after a while he smiled too, the small private smile of a man who believes that the world, despite everything, is still capable of putting broken things back together. In the months that followed, Evelyn and Constance transformed the mill, not into a business, not into a monument, into a gathering place, a center, where the community could come together the way it once had when the looms were running, and the Whitfield name meant something more than a forgotten tragedy. They opened a workshop space for local artisans. They created a small lending library in the back room. They hosted Thursday evening suppers where anyone could come and eat and talk and simply be among neighbors. Evelyn set up a sewing machine by the tall windows where the morning light was best. Constance, who turned out to have an extraordinary talent for baking that she had hidden for decades behind Judith's rigid meal plans, started bringing pies and bread that people drove 20 miles to taste. Walter built shelves. He repaired the roof. He installed new wiring and plumbing and a wood stove that kept the main hall warm through the mountain winter. He never asked for recognition, and Evelyn never offered it in words. She showed it in other ways, a hand on his arm when he passed by, a plate set aside for him at every supper, a chair next to hers on the porch of the Ridge Rest, where they sat together in the evenings and watched the stars appear over the valley. One evening in early spring, Evelyn stood alone at the front entrance of the mill. The dogwoods were beginning to bloom along the road, white petals catching the last light of a long day. The air was cool and carried the green smell of new growth rising from the valley floor. Inside she could hear voices, Constance laughing at something Don Harlan had said, the clink of dishes, the low murmur of a room full of people who had come to a place that not long ago nobody wanted. She reached into her pocket and found the keys. She held them one last time. Then she hung them on a small hook beside the front door, right where anyone could find them, and stepped inside. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your answer to this question. Is there a door in your life you've been afraid to open? And what do you think might be waiting on the other side?